Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this event, DC Drama, Budget Cuts, Tariffs, ICE Raids, and the Court Unpacked. My name is Gabriel Kramer. I'm a third year in the college studying law, letters, and society and economics, and I'm from Washington, D.C., where all of the things you will hear about this evening happened. I also participated in the IOP's internship program in D.C. this summer, working for the Cook Political Report. From mass layoffs of federal workers to the National Guard on the streets, the DC drama over the past few months has been hard to miss in the district. I'm honored to introduce our four panelists to explain all of it. Stephen Vladek is a professor of law at Georgetown University. He is the author of The Shadow Docket about the Supreme Court's increasing use of emergency rulings and writes the One First newsletter. Anna Swanson is a trade and international economics reporter for the New York Times. She covered the Trump administration's tariff policies this summer. She previously wrote for the Washington Post. Jessica Riedel is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute who studies budget, tax, and economic policy. She was previously Senator Rob Portman's chief economist and worked on economic policy for multiple presidential campaigns. Vince Warren is the executive director of the Center for Constitutional Rights, a legal advocacy organization promoting civil and human rights causes. He's currently working on immigration litigation against the Trump administration. He is also a Pritzker Fellow at the IOP this fall. The conversation will be moderated by IOP Senior Director and former New York Times reporter Jennifer Steinauer. We ask you that you please silence your cell phones during the event. There will be a Q&A at the end of the event, and students will be given priority for questions. Keep an eye out for 2 microphones in the audience. If you're new to the IOP, we are the place on campus to hear from the most knowledgeable practitioners in politics and policy, but we're also a place to build community over hot chocolate and political trivia after class, so please stop by. If you're curious about future events, including tomorrow's Chicago-style event on ICE activity in Chicago, or Monday's pop-up on the shifting domestic politics around Israel and Gaza, please visit politics.uchicago.edu. And now, please give a warm welcome to Professor Stephen Vladek, Anna Swanson, Jessica Riedel, Vince Warren, and Jennifer Steinauer.
Okay, I think that set the tone. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the first IOP Speaker Series event of the academic year. Special shout out to our first years. Hello. I hope this isn't the first time. I hope this isn't the last time you come and interact with us. We're pleased to have you here. And I'm grateful, especially to these 4 experts who've taken time tonight to come here to sort of set the table for a lot of what I think we're going to be talking about at the IOP the entire academic year. And here on stages and over at the House in our fellow seminars. Often events in Washington can feel very abstract when we're sitting here in Chicago or very far away. I think it's less so today. Today, people's flights are delayed at O'Hare because of a slowdown due to an air traffic control due to the government shutdown. We know that ICE and National Guard are descending even at this very moment and pitting our federal government against our governor and the mayor. So the Supreme Court is not physically here as per se, but their imprimatur is on everything pretty much that we're going to be discussing tonight. So we have a lot of policy areas to cover. There's a lot of these policy areas are interconnected with what everyone's going to be talking about, and I want to leave plenty of time for all of your questions. So I'm going to dive right in. Let's start with the shutdown. Jessica, is this government shutdown, how is this government shutdown unlike other government shutdowns? Do you think that this is a culmination of the budget impasses and the political problems as has been happening on the Hill basically since the second Trump administration started, or do you think that's not related? Where are we with that?
Well, thank you again, and thank you all for coming out. In one way, this shutdown is like most of the others. I've been watching government shutdowns for 30 years, and usually the cause of a government shutdown is essentially one party wanting to attach a certain set of legislative demands to a continuing resolution, which is a bill that keeps the government funded while they're negotiating. This time around, the Democrats wanted to attach an extension of Affordable Care Act subsidies that's expiring. In that way, this is a very traditional government shutdown where one party sees the opportunity to attach one of their goals to must-pass legislation. But there's a difference between this one and past government shutdowns. Neither party wants it to end. Usually during a government shutdown, there's a very big political backlash for the reasons that you're seeing right now. National parks close, air traffic control gets slowed down, government employees aren't paid, food safety inspectors aren't doing their job. Usually there's a very big backlash. What's unique about this shutdown is even though it's for an issue that's pretty solvable, whether to extend Affordable Care Act or not, the Republicans want this shutdown because President Trump wants to pick a fight and he wants an excuse to lay off more federal workers and cut more federal spending. He wants to go to war with government. This gives him what he considers to be emergency powers. But the Democrats want the shutdown too, not just for the Affordable Care Act subsidies, but because there's a malaise within the Democratic Party right now. There's a concern that they're not fighting enough. And even if they have a losing hand, they want to go to war. And this is a symbolic fight for Democrats to draw to show they're tough. So a budget nerd like me looks at it and goes, this should be something that they could get into a room and solve in 10 minutes. But then I look at it politically and say, you know, the Republicans aren't even in town. The Republican House is on vacation. Members of Congress are milking this on both sides. President Trump is milking it. This could go for a while.
I think they call that homework week, not vacation. But anyway, Anna, let's talk about tariffs. Talk about a crazy summer. It's like every time you pick up the newspaper, there was a 50% tariff, then it was 20%, then you're free to go. Then you're going to have more tariffs. It's really hard to keep track of it. Fortunately, you've had to. That's your job. So who's got tariffs right now? And maybe we're going to talk about this in more detail, but could you just give us a little taste too, when you talk about where things stand, just give us a little preview that we'll go to deeper of where it's surprisingly tariffs are, perhaps to those who were critical of them, not increasing inflation, or is it helping with inflation, and where are some pain points we're already seeing in the economy?
Definitely. So thank you so much for having me here. I'm delighted to be on this campus for the first time.
She went to Northwestern.
I went to Northwestern. I never came to the South Side, but I'm so glad to be here now. So I have been covering trade for the New York Times for 8 years. So during the first Trump administration as well, which we all thought was pretty wild back then. During that time period, there was the trade war with China. The president put significant tariffs on foreign steel and aluminum, solar panels, washing machines. So we thought, at the time there was a lot going on. This administration has really just turned the volume up kind of tenfold. So, all of that has happened just in a matter of weeks with this administration. And we are seeing now tariffs of a higher level than we have had in the United States in roughly a century. So just this really kind of grand economic experiment. And the tariffs kind of fall into different categories. So one of the president's big measures was on April 1st, which is what he dubbed Liberation Day. He walked out into the Rose Garden and he announced tariffs globally on all nations. And he called these his reciprocal tariffs, saying that they would balance out trade deficits, which certainly you could argue with. But those right now are on every country and in the double digits, so ranging from 10% up to, I think, 50% for Brazil. And then he's also put a lot of tariffs on strategic sectors. So again, we have steel and aluminum, we have cars, new tariffs on pharmaceuticals, trucks, even recently upholstered furniture, which again, you can quibble with whether that is a critical sector, a national security issue. But he's really introducing expansive tariffs in that way as well. And some other, other tariffs as well. But the first tranche I mentioned will be considered in a Supreme Court case coming up as well. So I would say when it comes to the effect of tariffs on consumers, it has been a little surprising to people that, the inflationary effects from them have been a little subdued. They've taken some time to be felt. To me, there are really probably three big reasons for that. The first is that supply chains are just, slow. It takes a lot of time to bring things across the ocean. Companies tend to plan ahead, order ahead. And also there was really an incredible amount of stockpiling when President Trump came into office. US imports just, shot up. The president did claim at one point that he had cut the trade deficit in half, but it's really because he almost doubled it. So it really spiked after he came into office, and then trade has fallen since then. In addition, I think there's a little bit of, there's just a lot of uncertainty. I mean, companies have been uncertain whether or not these tariffs will stay on, and so that's made them uncertain about raising prices. And then they're also uncertain about how the economy right now and whether consumers are going to accept that. So they've been a little cautious when it comes to increasing prices, but we are seeing it now. We are seeing prices of goods pick up, goods inflation pick up, while service inflation is more subdued, so it's kind of netting out.
And we'll get into some specifics. Like, some people on this panel might have gone to the wine store recently and seen a little bit of increase in their French wine, for example. So there are probably some places that we can talk about specifically. But Vince, let's talk about the Constitution first.
The what?
There are some people, maybe in this room, who believe that we're facing a generational, maybe multi-generational threats to the Constitution. There are others who say that's hyperbolic. And let's put it in a global context. The United States is pretty much in this similar political moment as much as the rest of the world. So this is your life's work. This is what you get up to do every day. What is your sort of 40,000-foot view of where things are? And maybe you could single out the one thing that really keeps you up at night in terms of in this context.
Well, first of all, I wanted to say that I totally get the upholstered furniture thing.
Yes.
I totally do, because you know why? Because upholstered furniture is the fabric of our democracy.
Wow.
I just killed the vibe. Thank you for having me. It's really great. It's actually very difficult to think about the one thing that keeps me up at night, because it all does. But there's a muscularity in this administration's approach that is very, very concerning. And I remember talking to folks a while back, earlier in the administration, when we were very concerned about the constitutional crisis question, about whether if the courts were to say no, would this administration do it anyway? And then what do we do? And there's been a lot of discussion, Stephen and my field around the rules that are set up in the event that something like that happens. I think that it's a very real possibility. One of the things that I think is a tremendous challenge is, number one, is that this administration is very actively testing the rules. And that's not atypical of a number of administrations. There are times in which administrations have a vision for the way that the world or the country needs to move forward, and they see the courts and sometimes Congress in getting in the way. But there is a sort of an elasticity around that exchange that at least I had felt very certain would not sort of break. And I'm really feeling that this administration, in testing those rules, is testing them for a particular purpose. And the purpose is not so much what will the courts do, but how will people react when the courts say no and they do it anyway. And I think that's the thing that really keeps me up at night. Also, I know that Stephen is going to talk about the Supreme Court. One of the things that's very confusing, I think, for a lot of folks following along is the cadence is, here's the executive order, here's the proclamation, and then everybody marches into court. And then there's this weird moment where the lower courts will say, guess what, no, you can't do that. We're not gonna allow that. And they will issue an injunction only to be very quickly overturned by an appeals court perhaps, and if not by the appeals court, then by this, the Supreme Court, or the Supreme Court won't even get to the merits question. They'll say, go ahead and do it and we'll figure it out later. Or by the way, you can't do nationwide injunctions anymore. So there's a lot of chicanery that's going on in the federal judiciary that also gives me pause, because I don't think we were really made for the question of the Mad King and what we actually do.
And we'll get to some of the specifics on that. And I think it's also fair to say, look, every administration exercises executive authority, and obviously Joe Biden had a lot of executive orders that were challenged in court as well. So that's not the new part. I think that it's interesting that you say what happens when the courts say you can't do that. We had Amy Coney Barrett on stage about a month ago, and she was asked, well, what happens? You don't really, the Supreme Court doesn't have an enforcement structure if the Supreme Court rules in a certain way and the president doesn't follow that. And she said, yeah. So I think that shows you some of the sense of like, maybe this is unprecedented for a lot of folks. But let's pivot to the Supreme Court. That is why you're here, Professor. And I want to start with.
She said, yeah.
She said, yeah. So this is because what I mean, and it's an understandable reaction, right? They don't have, there's not a police force it's out of the Supreme Court that's going to go and enforce these decisions. So it is an interesting moment, but we're going to go back to that. But let's dial back to summer, because that's what we're talking about here. What did you miss over the summer? And a lot of what happened over the summer happened on the shadow docket. Which I think also at that Amy Coney Barrett event, we were told that term was actually invented here.
It was,
at the
across the
University
Midway.
of Chicago.
Yep.
So tell us, bring all of the non-L1s here up to speed on what is the shadow docket, why does it matter, and what was new about its application this summer?
Sure. So the term was coined by Will Bode, who's a professor at the law school, and I think, although it shouldn't matter, a former clerk to Chief Justice Roberts, just to give you a sense of where he falls on things. And Will meant it as really just this evocative shorthand for all of the nerdy technical things that the Supreme Court does through orders, so through unexplained rulings, as opposed to through the lengthy opinions that we're used to reading in undergraduate and graduate and law school classes. Historically, the court didn't do a lot through those kinds of orders. I mean, there were lots of those orders, but they were usually perfunctory. They were, denying discretionary review. They were denying, meritless efforts to sort of adjust the status quo. And what the space where it has become very, very different over the last 10 years is what's called emergency relief. So if you figure it takes a case anywhere from 1 to 3 years to go from inception to a final decision by the Supreme Court, the question is, what should the status quo be for the duration of that interim period? If you're challenging a government policy, should the policy be blocked for the duration of the appeal? Should it go into effect? And emergency relief is when the lower courts say one thing about that answer, and an appeals court says, nope, we disagree. Not because we're sure you're going to win or we're sure you're going to lose, but because we think the status quo should be not X instead of X. Historically, the Supreme Court did not do this very often, at least in part because it wasn't asked to do this very often. Across the Bush and Obama administrations, so two slightly different two-term presidencies, there were a total from the federal government of 8 requests for emergency relief. That's 8 in 16 years. I know that many of you chose politics because you didn't want to do math, but I think we can do that one. And then it ratcheted up dramatically during the first Trump administration to 41 across 4 years. So we went from 1 every 2 years to 1 every 6 or 7 weeks. Then it slowed back down a bit during Biden. And then during the first 8 months in office, President Trump in his second term filed 28 of these applications. And the Supreme Court has granted 23 consecutive applications at the request of the Trump administration. Part of the issue is that traditionally, because the Supreme Court didn't do this often, because it tended to come in relatively non-nationally important contexts, The justices got into this habit of not telling us what the vote count was, of not writing opinions, of not explaining what they were doing, on the theory that it was just a temporary case-specific expedient. But now that these orders are having the effect of putting back into place massively significant nationwide policies, whether it is the removal of every single transgender individual in the military from military service, whether it is cutting the Department of Education by 34%, whether it is allowing the president to do a pocket rescission of $4 billion in foreign aid funding. I mean, I can keep going, but like, these are all massively important rulings. Now, Jeff, you asked what's different, right? So it's not just the volume that's different. The court is also now insisting, really for the first time, that even when it's not writing an opinion in these cases, these interim orders are precedents. And the precedents are ones that lower courts have to follow, so much so that in August, Justice Neil Gorsuch wrote a concurring opinion in the NIH funding case where he criticized 3 lower court judges who he claimed had defied the Supreme Court by not following earlier rulings on these applications. There are reasons factually why that claim is just insane. But it reverberated very loudly across the federal judiciary to the point that we've seen over the last 6 weeks lower court judges appointed by Democratic and Republican presidents publicly criticizing the Supreme Court's behavior in a way that, frankly, I've never seen before. It's not unheard of to criticize decisions, but it's that point. It's the court issuing more of these rulings with broader impacts, not explaining itself, and then still expecting everyone to basically read their minds. Other than that, though, everything's fine.
Okay. Well, your homework for the next few minutes while I go down the line here again is to think about which ones you think are most significant and impactful, and we will connect it also to the tariffs. Jessica, let's go back to money and spending. Let's talk about DOGE. One of the hallmarks of this administration is just constant churn, right? Just this keeps the news business going. It's just huge seismic things happen, and then a week later something else happens and we forget about it. DOGE was a big deal. The DOGE Meister seems to have left the building, at least for now. He doged himself, I guess. What were the lasting impacts from what you can tell? Not so much politically, although that is interesting in terms of whether that got people undoged. But do you think, do we have now a significantly smaller government?
We do not.
Okay.
This is an issue that I paid very close attention to because for 25 years in Washington, I have been mapping ways to save the federal government money and coming up with spending cut plans and responsible ways to do it and building political coalitions. And then DOGE comes in and they bring a bunch of Silicon Valley bros in who don't know the first thing about the government. They don't know how to work the agencies. They don't know the accounting. And they just kind of go in and break things. Ultimately, DOGE is spending cut theater. It was not designed to actually cut spending because 75% of all federal spending goes to 6 items. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, defense, veterans, and interest. Instead, they went for the cultural totems. We're going to force the government to get rid of its Politico subscriptions. We're going to go after DEI contracts. We're going to fire government employees. We're going to defund HIV funding in Africa because it's those poor HIV children in Africa who are driving up the budget deficit. These are budget dust. They're not budget dust to the recipients. They're not budget dust to the employers who lost their job. But in the context of a $7 trillion budget, they're budget dust. They don't really save any money, but they excite MAGA. They excite MAGA voters, and they create the impression of government spending cuts that make it easier to go cut taxes. I mean, ultimately, Elon Musk came in and originally promised he was going to cut $2 trillion of the $7 trillion federal budget. Then he said, okay, maybe I exaggerated a bit, $1 trillion. And then he said, okay, $350 billion. By my estimate, and I wrote a column on this for The Atlantic a couple months ago, I think they're saving about $5 to $6 billion a month. which is annualized about $70 billion out of a $7 trillion budget. That's 1% of federal spending. And in fact, the budget deficit is looking as big as last year. Federal spending is up 5% over last year. And the final kind of insult about DOGE is that for all their concern about cutting budget deficits, DOGE could actually ultimately increase budget deficits because they're trying to lay off so many IRS staffers that the IRS won't be able to collect as much of the income taxes or audit tax cheats, which means for the IRS, for every dollar they save in firing somebody, they may lose $10 of tax collections. Now, Elon Musk has left, which means DOGE doesn't have a lot of credibility in Washington anymore. It's not intimidating members of Congress like it used to. Trump isn't talking much about it. So for the overall budget concerns, DOGE was full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. And this concerns me as a budget geek and a deficit hawk, because we still have budget deficits of $1.8 trillion today, heading to $3.6 trillion in the next decade, or $4 trillion if interest rates rise.
So you've been obviously, as you said, a long-time deficit hawk, budget hawk, worked for conservatives, have written for conservative publications about this. So do you think there was any opportunity to do any changes to Social Security or Medicare or Medicaid programs? Do you think that that was ever on the table?
Never on the table. There were some policies on the table to streamline the Social Security offices, lay off some Social Security workers, tell 80-year-olds to go get your benefits online. My mother could never figure out how to do that. I'm sorry. With all due respect to a lot of the 80-year-olds who are more competent, people like my mom cannot do that. But ultimately, Trump got elected promising not to touch Social Security and Medicare. He got elected promising not to cut defense. He wasn't going to touch veterans. He took all the stuff that actually spends the money off the table. So all that was left was to go after African children with HIV, government employees, DEI contract recipients.
So let's pivot back to trade. So can we talk a little bit about winners and losers, because and how this reflects upon the prior Trump term. I seem to understand that farmers may be once again getting some relief. I mean, how does this work? Is it just the industry that gets the most pissed off, or like how is it decided who's getting tariff relief?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's taken some time to kind of play out and to become clear, but I do think that is becoming clearer. So, farmers, of course, are a very important constituency for the president. So we do have the makings of a farm bailout, which also happened in the first administration. But farmers have been very hurt as well, particularly by actions by China, which was really only, the only kind of major country to really retaliate against the tariffs, put a tariff on soybeans and has stopped buying. That has been extremely harmful for farmers, and they are starting to make some noise. I do think you've seen basically kind of every industry group run to Washington, try to make their case in private. Very, very few are comfortable speaking publicly still at this point. Very do not want to be publicly critical of the president. They think that could, be more negative for them in the long run. But one very interesting thing that you've seen is that when the administration first came out with some of their measures, they said that there would be no exclusions and no exceptions to the tariffs. And that has clearly not been the case. So Apple, for example, got a very major exclusion. Other big industries, pharmaceuticals recently also got a very big carve out to the pharmaceutical tariffs. And when you look at the through line, through the parties that are getting these exceptions, they tend to be very powerful, very wealthy companies that, have the power to lobby in Washington, have the ability to donate. I think, talking to a lot of folks, the sense now is who is really getting screwed in America is really small business. that they feel like they do not have a voice in Washington. They also don't have the capacity in their companies to often deal with kind of the bureaucracy, the red tape surrounding tariffs. Now I think there is a pretty clear divide, not just in terms of certain industries, but in terms of sort of big money business and small business owners.
That makes sense. I'm going to pivot away from some of this stuff now, Vince. There's a million individual cases we could talk about. Maybe some students will ask you about them when we go to Q&A. I want to talk about the case with the boats off of Venezuela. The U.S. military has carried out, I think, 4 strikes now against boats operating in the Caribbean. It killed over 20 people, and they have said the boats are narco-trafficking vessels. I think there are some people we've talked to in Venezuela who confirm that that is an area that's controlled a lot by the narco-trafficking industry, as it were, but there's sort of all kind of happening under the darkness. We don't really know. We haven't had these folks identified. Is that an example, getting out of some of the domestic issues, is that another example where you think the constitutional issues that you're concerned with come into play, or what's your reflection on that?
Well, I mean, I think the basic question there is it okay for the administration, the military, to kill drug dealers extrajudicially without any sort of hearing, without any sort of factual? Is that okay? Does that constitute, does their, assuming that there are drug dealers on the boat, assuming they're drugs, assuming that they're doing it, is that okay to do as a matter of international law? Is that something that we would want to support happening? And, I think that the framing that the administration is using particularly around narco-terrorism, we were talking about this in my seminar today. So one of the students brought up that in Pam Bondi's discussion today, talking about Chicago, interestingly enough, she was talking about narco-terrorism, and that the idea that drug dealers are terrorists, which sort of flips the idea from a criminal activity to an international terrorism activity, provides the administration, they're thinking, the justification to kill people extrajudicially. The problem is that international law does not allow for that, and I'm not suggesting that we should take a pure international law analysis of this. I think there's a political analysis as well, but the international law does not allow this to happen. We're not at war. These are people that there's no threat that would sort of justify that level of killing. It just doesn't exist. So this is pure political theater using drug dealing as a prop. It's terrifying, quite honestly, because there are rules that might differentiate doing this in international waters and doing this in Chicago. But what history and recent history is replete with examples of how these things turn domestically really quickly. You think about the Duterte regime in the Philippines, and his whole political arc was around not just killing drug dealers, but killing drug users. And I'm increasingly challenged to think about where are the lines that are drawn in our jurisprudence that would actually prevent that policy from happening. And the other challenge is that it's difficult in these international cases to file lawsuits. Where do you get plaintiffs? These are foreign countries, and it's going to be a real challenge to be able to sort of bring these issues to federal court. But it is a serious, serious problem that I think people should be very concerned about.
Can you bring this section of the conversation back to the courts? Do you anticipate more activity around these international issues, the domestic issues? What was most in terms of the shadow docket again? What was most surprising to you? I know there were many, but it's like, wow, they did that with very little explanation. And what does that sort of presage now that they're back in session?
Yeah, so to the first part, I think Vince is right that there are serious procedural obstacles to litigation over foreign and overseas uses of military force. Vince has spent a lot of time, I've spent less time, mostly just following Vince around, trying to get around those procedural obstacles, but they're serious. I think more likely is more litigation around domestic use of the military. And so we're already seeing that here in Chicago. We see it in Portland. We've seen it in Los Angeles. We saw it a little bit in DC, and I think that's where a lot of this is going to go first. And that ties to the question about sort of the shadow docket ruling that surprised me the most. So I will say, I don't know that I was that surprised by the outcomes in any of those cases. I mean, one of the things that's worth stressing is, even though there have been an unprecedented number of emergency applications to the court from the Trump administration, they're still being very choosy. They're losing so many cases in the lower courts that the unprecedented number of emergency applications is still a tiny subset of the overall cases where they're losing and not appealing, and we don't tend to talk about those, even though those are actually really important signs that at least some of the guardrails are holding. I would say that the opinion that drove me the most bananas, which is a form of surprise, was an opinion that Justice Brett Kavanaugh wrote last month in a case about ICE raids in Southern California. So this is a case called Nome versus Vasquez Perdomo. And the plaintiffs in that case were challenging an ICE policy of stopping people in and around Los Angeles. I just want to open my phone so I can actually get the exact wording right. And the stops were based on one of the following four factors: the stopped person's apparent race or ethnicity, that they were speaking Spanish or speaking English with an accent, their presence at a particular location, like a bus stop or a car wash or a tow yard or a day labor or pickup site, or the type of work that they do. Hopefully you don't need to be a lawyer or a law student to know that none of those things are actually evidence of any unlawful behavior. And the district court said, like, you can pick up people based on these factors plus, right? You can pick up people where these are some of the things that are forming your reasonable suspicion. You can't do just this. And so the district court issued an injunction. The Ninth Circuit, the Federal Appeals Court, denied the government's application for a stay. The Supreme Court, with no majority opinion, no explanation whatsoever, grants the stay, putting that policy back into effect. And Justice Kavanaugh, who I think felt some obligation to explain why he voted for this fakakta result, right, that's a legal term, wrote this concurring opinion. And the first part of the opinion is a little technical. He says, you know, maybe the plaintiffs are going to lose on standing. Maybe the plaintiffs can't show that they really face a risk of being picked up again. But then the second part of his opinion, he says, and in any event, I think the government's going to win on the Fourth Amendment question. And to that point, right, he said, and I'm going to quote this, not surprisingly, given those extraordinary numbers, by the way, he talks about the numbers of illegal immigrants, his term, in Los Angeles. He doesn't talk about the number of legal migrants or citizens who meet those four criteria, which seem like a relevant part of the story. Says, not surprisingly, U.S. immigration officers have prioritized immigration enforcement in the Los Angeles area. The government sometimes makes brief investigative stops to check the immigration status of those who gather in locations where people are hired for day jobs, et cetera, et cetera. And if the officers learn that the individual they stopped is a U.S. citizen or otherwise lawful in the United States, they promptly let the individual go. Okay. The record in that case was to the contrary, right? The district court said that's not true and had plaintiffs who had testified to how they had been held for 45 minutes, an hour longer, even though they were citizens, even though they had real IDs and had produced them immediately, right? We've probably all seen videos online of stops that don't sound very brief and releases that don't look very prompt. You probably saw the story about the raid on the apartment building here in Chicago, right? I don't know what world he's living in. And my concern is that, like, if that's where justices and judges of that particular ideological ilk think we are, how do you persuade them that that's not what's happening on the ground? Folks online have started calling ICE detention stops Kavanaugh stops. I don't really like that term because I think it makes light of something that is incredibly serious, but it was that opinion was the one that I thought really went even further toward me being nervous that the Supreme Court is not ready for the moment that we're in.
Were any of those lower court decisions by Republican appointee judges?
There was a Republican appointee on the Ninth Circuit panel. The district judge was a Biden appointee.
Can I comment on this? Because that is, I'm so glad that you mentioned that. That is the case that makes me bananas as well, for exactly the same reasons that you said. I just want to add two things. One is I'm glad that you read that recitation of what Kavanaugh said, and I think it stands as a model as to why, first of all, Supreme Court justices should not write opinions based on ChatGPT, because it sounds like a ChatGPT. What happens during a stop? Well, so it's problematic. But I think the other...
They're detained briefly and pleasantly.
Yes, exactly, and given muffins. But the other kind of piece that really sticks to me is that sticks out at me is that when you look at that opinion in light of the affirmative action opinion, that we have a situation where the Supreme Court says you cannot use race when it comes to college admissions, but you can use race when it comes to immigration, detention, and that sort of thing. So
in a part of the country where 90% of the people of Latino descent are lawfully present in the United States.
Absolutely, yeah. So it's you can't use race to get Latino people into college, but you can use race to put them in jail. Like that's what this Supreme Court seems to be trying to get us to buy, that these two things don't line up and that there are other things that are at play. But that's really where they're going, and I think what they're about.
And we'll talk about, if we have some time, to get back to the implications of the session now, but let's go back to the economy. So, and let's talk about the markets. Let's get away from DC a little bit and talk about the capital markets. I mean, the economy is being bolstered by a huge investment in AI. And I think, Anna, you said a through line here are powerful corporations that have been able to navigate these tariffs. I think another through line with a lot of this is big tech, right? Mm-hmm. How it impacted Doge, how it plays with who gets a break from administration as it pertains to tariffs and other things. But just 7 large technology companies are responsible for nearly 60% of the gains in the S&P this year. And OpenAI alone had $12 billion in annualized revenue and $8 billion in annualized losses. So how do we connect the dots here? Is this another possible dot-com boom and bust type situation that could occur? Or is President Trump's policies actually creating an atmosphere for the economy to be actually rather stable and unemployment to be rather stable, and the capital markets, which we know are his biggest arbiter of how things are going, have remarkably recovered after the early days of turmoil. So how do you contextualize that?
I think the economy is facing some serious headwinds right now. And it's really nothing that is going to be solved in the short term, unfortunately. Economic growth is basically the sum of the growth of labor supply and productivity. Well, labor supply growth is falling to zero over the long term because of low fertility, retiring baby boomers, and low immigration. In fact, by 2031, deaths are going to outnumber births in America, meaning that the only growth in population is going to come from immigration, which is itself being stopped.
Except from South Africa.
Yeah. Oh boy. So if you're not going to get growth, in fact, if you're going to have no labor supply growth, then to maintain our current economic growth, you need to double productivity rates. And productivity has been pretty mediocre. It's been about 1.3% since 2000. If you're getting no labor supply growth and you're getting 1.3% productivity, congratulations, the economy is only growing 1.3% per year. That's not very good. Even if you want the economy to grow 2.5% a year, you need to double productivity. AI is supposedly the savior. I was on a panel last week where Doug Holtz-Eakin mentioned that he's reading studies suggesting that productivity could raise 20% per year when AI is enacted or becomes more of a reality. My caution is, I remember the internet boom. I remember the late 80s, early 90s, when the internet and computers were going to revolutionize the economy and we're going to revolutionize growth. And all of this capital investment poured into the internet boom. And around 1990, there were a bunch of layoffs. There was corporate downsizing. We had a recession in 1990. Well, ultimately, we adopted computers, we adopted technology. Productivity bumped up about 1 point per year from 1992 to 2005, and then it went back. It really didn't revolutionize the economy, and in fact, the investment in it, much like AI, became a bubble. Some of us in the room remember the late 90s dot-com bubble and how it crashed. A lot of people in this room don't remember it, which is kind of amazing. I feel old. I think for AI, we see the investment and we need to hope for the best in terms of productivity, but don't bet the economy on it. We might get a bump from AI. It might be a temporary bump for 13 years like we got from the internet boom. It might be a permanent, increasing, soaring boom. We just don't know yet. And my worry is that the people in Washington are essentially betting the economy on this. They're saying, we don't need labor supply, we don't need more workers, we definitely don't need immigrants, we're just gonna soar productivity from AI. I hope they're right, but I think 8 of the last 10 predicted utopias failed. So we'll see.
Anna, I want to go back to something you mentioned in China, but I just wondered if you had any response to that. Do you think that ties in at all to what you're covering?
Yeah, definitely. So I wrote today about the World Trade Organization's forecast for global growth declining, but they also said this year so far was not as bad as they had projected, in part because of trade in AI goods lifting trade growth. So it actually accounted for, I think, half of trade growth in maybe the first half of the year. I might be getting the time period wrong, even though those goods are only 10% of global merchandise trade. So, I mean, they're very expensive, right? So I think also, there's a serious limiting factor when it comes to investments in AI in terms of energy, in terms of water, right? So, those things will come to bear on this at some point.
But let's pick up on China. You mentioned it earlier, and it is the kind of most fascinating case here. I think it was fairly recently that Xi Jinping, the leader of China, I think he told a bunch of business leaders in his country, China's ready to be a partner and a friend of the United States. While they're getting smacked in the face by some of the larger tariffs, right? So can you kind of talk about this in a little bit of a foreign policy context?
Yeah, I actually think this is kind of one of the most mysterious, one of the most pivotal parts of the relationship. President Trump came into office. He has a lot of hawks in his party, in his cabinet, people who would prefer to decouple with China. But I don't think that's really where the president is or where he's ever been. He is not someone who is a national security hawk. He sees himself much more as a deal maker. He's kind of willing to, flexibly wheel and deal with everything if he thinks it can give him an advantage, whether it's US sales of AI chips to China, whether it's the status of Taiwan, nuclear cooperation. So I think he just has a much more flexible view of the relationship. But that also doesn't mean that, he also will still support very aggressive actions against China. So earlier this year, tariffs on Chinese products rose to a minimum of 145%. That was really enough to just kind of bring trade to a standstill. The president got warnings about empty store shelves and rising costs and backed off of that quite quickly. The other thing that happened is that China, did show its willingness to retaliate and demonstrated kind of its control over the global economy. So it clamped down on exports of rare earth metals and minerals that are very important to US automakers, very important to defense industries. And so a lot of those industries, came to the president complaining about that. And now we're at this kind of pivotal moment in the relationship. The president is going to Asia soon. He's expected to meet with Xi Jinping on the sidelines of APEC. And there's this discussion about, will there be a big, beautiful deal with China? What I'm hearing is that there really isn't the kind of work going back and forth to do that, but that he could be open to, some kind of deal that involves purchases, perhaps some kind of deal that involves investment, which might be kind of unprecedented. as well. So there's a lot up in the air. One final thing I think is really interesting is just that, while the president has been aggressive on China, he's actually been far more, as or maybe more aggressive on other trading partners. Right now, for example, we have 50% tariffs on India. So a lot of companies in past years had been moving their supply chains out of China to places like India, to Southeast Asia. Now they're confronted with this landscape where all of these other countries have very high tariffs. They have a lot of uncertainty. A lot of companies now are telling me they're just staying put. They're happy to be in China, in this landscape of global uncertainty. So that has kind of, backfired as well.
So it's a checkmate that not many countries probably have the capabilities and resources to pull off the way China did, perhaps. By the way, we're going to go to questions in about 10 minutes. They're for students, so students think about your question, and there'll be, I think, 2 mics, and I will call on them in between. So as soon as you see those mics out, go ahead and line up, because we would like to take as many questions as we can from you from the panel. So can we talk just for a second, Vince, about the National Guard, especially since they're arriving in Chicago as we speak? And I know that there's a lot of talk about what is unprecedented use of the Guard, and I was hoping you could put a little context for that. I was at one part of the Pullman Memorial this weekend. Not all of it, because it was closed due to the shutdown. But I did read a placard there about unrest around labor disputes there that the National Guard came to, I think against the will of the government in Illinois and Chicago, right? So sometimes we think things are unprecedented, but actually there are lots of stories in our history of precedent. So what is unusual, if anything, about this particular moment? And I know you talked a little bit in your seminar today comparing the use of National Guard responding to desegregation cases in the South. So what is sort of your view from 20,000 feet?
Yeah, so the use of the power of the National Guard is not unprecedented. It's happened a lot of times over the years with different presidents. What's unprecedented, I think, is the totally made up factual basis for the purposes of doing this. That's the piece that I think is new and unsettling and shocking. There's sort of a constellation of laws that allow the presidents to do these things. There's a thing called, I'm forgetting the name of it, the
Insurrection Act?
The one, that it's an exception to the
Posse Comitatus Act.
Posse Comitatus Act. I'll have, it's like
it's a
password, right?
Yeah.
Posse Comitatus Act, which is a general prohibition on using federal troops for civilian purposes. And then there's the Insurrection Act, which acts as an exception to that. And the Insurrection Act has been invoked numerous times throughout U.S. history, and there are various ways in which the president can do that. So, for example, it was invoked in, I believe, 1957 during the Central High School desegregation efforts to be able to protect the students that were desegregating Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. It was also used in the 1990s around the Rodney King, the uprising around the Rodney King. And in our discussion today, we were talking about, in those two circumstances, you can make the argument that there were a lot of people in Little Rock that said, hell no, we're not going to have these black kids go to our school, and you might consider it to be a useful way to think about presidential power by saying, well, the state of Arkansas is not going to enforce the federal law and the Supreme Court mandate, so we're going to be able to have federal troops to be able to escort these students in. Like, we might be able to say that's a useful way to do it. In the 1990s Rodney King context, which is a little bit more challenging to me, you did have, for people that remember it was bananas. There was all sorts of things that were happening. People were getting shot, people were getting run over with cars, and they were brought in to be able to support an overwhelmed Los Angeles Police Department. But what we have now is the National Guard being invoked again in federal troops in Los Angeles, not because the Los Angeles Police Department can't do the job, but for two reasons. One is that the administration is saying, that the activists in Los Angeles are so violent and horrible that they're going to overrun the federal troops, and therefore, the federal law enforcement, and so the troops need to be brought in for federal law enforcement. In Chicago, it's a different thing. They're saying they're not so much worried about the federal troops being overrun, but they're worried about crime and the quote-unquote narco-terrorists. And so one of the students in the class really brought up that question. It's like, who actually is Trump protecting when he's calling this into question? So for me, it's the real challenge is not the fact of the federal power, which I have a general problem with, but it's actually how it's being wielded in this administration in many different ways, in different purposes, often very divorced from the facts, without giving a rationale that courts will look at as even reasonable, much less persuasive, and expecting to do that anyway. And also, there are challenges because you can bring in the federal troops whether the governor agrees or doesn't under certain circumstances. Washington, D.C. is different because the National Guard is under the control of the president there. So today, Pam Bondi was talking about how wonderful it was that Muriel Bowser just sort of said, oh, we're super excited to have these troops in here. And she was not excited. She just couldn't do anything about it. So there are these narratives that are forming that are very dangerous and essentially unmoored from the facts, and we're going to see more of that. By the way, I just want to throw this out. I know that a lot of people are like, what's so special about these cities? And there are a lot of blue cities and sanctuary cities and that kind of stuff. But with the exception of Portland, DC, New York, Chicago, Memphis, Los Angeles all have what? Black mayors.
Well, do you think that the presence of the National Guard in Washington, D.C. helped decrease crime while they were there?
No. I mean, I live in D.C. I think I can say with a little, they picked up a lot of trash on the National Mall. So that was super helpful. I guess they reduced littering. The problem is that, Vince is right. Like the historical distinction between it's not about local consent, right? It's about whether there is a factual predicate for the inability of federal civilian officials to enforce the relevant laws. And part of what's so striking about all of our conversation about the National Guard is we're not talking about ICE. Right? ICE, even though it's heavily militarized, is a civilian law enforcement agency. And so most of what was happening on the ground in DC, where it was away from the mall, where it was away from the tourists, wasn't the National Guard, it was ICE. ICE setting up checkpoints, ICE setting up, ICE doing roving patrols in Northeast, ICE having, traffic stops on 14th Street. And so, the Justice Department's own statistics had violent crime down 30 some odd %. Already before any of this happened. So I think part of the problem is that it really does appear to be pretextual. And Jennifer, then the question is, are courts going to look behind the pretext? Historically, the model has been very deferential to presidents of both parties. That when presidents in the national security and military space make particular factual determinations, courts have tended historically to not be especially willing to second guess those determinations. But there are reasons to, one, think that this president has an especially casual relationship with facts, but two, to think that courts are starting to push back. So there's something that we call in the law the presumption of regularity, the idea that all things being equal, the government acts in good faith. Not correctly, not legally, but just in good faith. We're starting to see cracks in that. And so, if you're up for reading judicial opinions, one that I'd recommend is from this weekend, from Judge Karen Immergut in Portland, who wrote an opinion respecting a temporary restraining order barring the use of the National Guard in Portland. Judge Immergut is a Trump appointee, right? This is not a bleeding heart liberal with an axe to grind. And she wrote an opinion about how, facts have to matter. Because if facts don't matter, then nothing is going to stop a president of any political persuasion from contriving whatever emergency he or she wants as a basis for claiming power. And, I think the last thing that's probably worth stressing is historically there was another constraint. There was an institution of government that we know, or at least used to know, as Congress. Part of why we are where we are is because Congress is just not exerting any kind of check. And there are long-term reasons for that. Jessica and I, I'm sure, have very rich and nuanced views on why. The short-term reality is that that's going to increase the points of confrontation between the president and the courts. And that's why we're seeing so much of our current moment be this pitched battle between lower courts and President Trump and then lower courts and the Supreme Court. And that's not going to abate anytime soon.
It is an interesting opinion. I would encourage people to read it because I think later on that may end up being a very seminal thing to read. I think there's a mic on the right. I don't see you. I'm told it's there. I'm going to start over there. We're going to go to questions. The usual rules apply. Question, please. Make it end in a question mark. Be as brief as possible. And our panelists will try to answer as briefly as possible, too, so that we can get to as many of your questions as we have here in the short time. So over on the right where I can't see you, go ahead.
Hello, my name is Alex Fuentes. I'm a third year in the college. My question is, Donald Trump won rural farmers pretty single-handedly. And yet despite the rampant tariff policy that seemed to be negatively affecting them, partially because they believe they wouldn't implement it. So why do we see this disconnect between voters and Donald Trump in the implementation of these policies?
Yeah, I can answer that. So in addition to covering trade for about a decade, I'm also from Iowa, so I have opinions about that. So you're right that American farmers are very dependent on international markets, very exporting to China, exporting to Mexico, Canada. These are huge markets for them. So they have been particularly hurt when other countries retaliate against tariffs. And we saw a lot more of that in the first term. In this term, it's actually been restrained, but the actions of China against soybean farmers have been really, really painful. For me, I think just thinking about where I come from and farmers, I think it's often more of a kind of a cultural issue. So it is more of just a kind of rural, urban, red, blue, conservative, liberal divide. There are a lot of issues that farmers care about also, pertaining to the environment and regulation from my experience. So a lot of times I'll, talk to farmers and they'll admit, this is hurting me personally, but, I still support the president. I think what he's doing to make trade fairer is right. At a certain point, some don't say that anymore, but that's generally my.
It does help when you get tariff relief also, I would imagine.
Right.
Over here,
billions of dollars of tariff relief do help. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Ellie Levy. I am a second year studying political science and theater and performance studies. My question is on the cancellation of Stephen Colbert and the temporary suspension of Kimmel seemingly caused by the Trump administration. Do you guys, this does have two parts, but A, believe that this was a violation of the First Amendment? And my bigger question is, do you believe that this is indicative of a culture shift within DC politics, or is it just a different tactic comparable to previous actions?
Okay, how long do we have?
Quickly.
The short answer is government coercion of private entities to take action based on disfavored speech is a textbook violation of the First Amendment. Proving it is hard. The government may often be able to identify either reasons why it wasn't them who did the coercion or reasons why it wasn't about speech. But there's actually a very, very important Supreme Court ruling from 2 years ago that's not well known, called NRA, National Rifle Association versus VULO, V-U-L-L-O, where actually a sort of a cross-ideological majority of the Supreme Court reinforced that the First Amendment does not tolerate that kind of behavior by the government. I'll just say, we're seeing it not just with Colbert and Jimmy Kimmel, we're seeing it with law firms, we're seeing it with universities. I mean, the extent to which we are seeing efforts right now by this administration to coerce private actors into taking particular conduct really ought to bother anyone, and especially folks who spent much of the last 4 years saying, we are First Amendment people. On the culture shift point, my concern is about tolerance, right? I mean, I think 10 years ago, any one of these episodes would have been a huge story. It would have been national headlines. It would have led to law review symposia about the decline of the First Amendment. Now it's Tuesday. And I just think that we got very quickly to, if not acceptance, at least desensitization to how completely abnormal it is for the government to basically coerce private actors into taking particular actions. And just to sort of, to be perfectly honest, where it started with TikTok on the first day in office. So, part of it was things people like, but I think it's actually been a terrible precedent where Colbert and Jimmy Kimmel are just the most visible examples.
Over to the right.
Hi, thank you all so much for coming to speak here. I am a student in the college. I'm a fourth year. I study philosophy and democracy studies. And my philosophy question has a lot to do with virtue. I'm very interested in what you would have to say with, do you think politics now, it's two questions, I guess. Do you think politics now has sort of these moral obligations that we've been taught from an early age, that it's been implemented in our judicial system and our executive system, and also where you think checks and balances has gone with all these lower courts trying to fight against the Supreme Court and the president, and you think that checks and balances are a system put in place to safeguard our rights, but now it kind of seems like everything's gone awry, and do you think this is all kind of just a waiting game, or are there consequences after this administration and in the years to come? Your thoughts on that?
Vince, you're probably closest to our philosophy major up here, so.
Sure. Well, I'll answer the second question. I think I understood that a little bit better around checks and balances. One of the things that I really put squarely in the post 9/11 period, so 20 some odd years ago, after the World Trade Centers came down and courts were really grappling with the government's sort of so-called war on terror. One of the things that began to happen was that Congress would capitulate and sort of let the executive sort of run the show. Courts would sort of do the same thing, and the government would say, well, we can't tell you all the secret stuff that's happening, but it's really super secret and it's really bad, so you have to let us do it. And that sort of tendency of courts to be in that position has not really abated at all. And so we've gone through the Bush years, we've gone through the Obama's years, 1 year of Trump, 1 year of Biden, and we're back to Trump again. And all of a sudden, the courts are still, as Steve was saying, in this position of thinking maybe, how do we wrestle with the question of deference? So I'm not saying that checks and balances are dead, but I do think that our bigger problem is I think both forced capitulation as well as political capitulation. At this point, when we start talking about bipartisan consensus, that we're really thinking it begins to manifest as sort of allowing the president and the executive to do whatever they want, and that's a huge, huge problem.
Hi, I'm Eduardo. I'm a second year here in the college. I study economics and political science, and I'm part of the student advisory board in the SAB. And thank you for coming here. So my question is, so basically since forever, the Chicago Police Department and UChicago's police department have been trying to solve the problem of violence with no success. And we have students, over the past few years getting mugged and even getting shot around campus, which is a big concern. Given that the National Guard has a great success in DC, stopping crime and reducing shootings and whatnot, and given that the presence of ICE here in Chicago has already caused civil unrest, is it not a great measure that the National Guard can ensure safety of ICE agents and the citizens in Chicago and other great cities? Thank you.
So first, I just vehemently resist the factual assumption in your question that the National Guard has reduced crime in Washington, D.C. It hasn't. And I'm not even aware of the administration touting any study that suggests that it has. So let's start there. The National Guard is not trained to do law enforcement. The military is not trained to do law enforcement. We use them in a pinch because they're personnel, because they have capacities that we don't otherwise have. But there's a big reason why historically this country has chafed against the idea that we should be policed by the military. It was one of the literal grievances in the Declaration of Independence in 1776 for why we were declaring our independence from Great Britain. It's reflected in the fact that the Constitution gives the power to control domestic use of the military to Congress, not the President. It's reflected in the Posse Comitatus Act, which expressly not just bars, but makes it a crime to use the military without authorization for law enforcement purposes. And so, you know, I don't know, I'm not here to say crime is not a problem in Chicago. I'm from Manhattan. I mean, crime is a problem. You know, I grew up walking through crime. But I don't know that the right way to solve it is by militarizing our cities. I think our culture, our history, our tradition are decidedly against it. And at least so far, I don't know that the evidence supports the notion that in other places it's had the success that you suggest.
Do we have anybody else on the right still? Yes, I see someone.
Hi, thank you all so much for coming to the panel. I'm Aria, I'm a first year in the college. My question was also on the National Guard. I remember a few weeks ago where Trump was saying that he was going to deploy the National Guard down in New Orleans, which seems to fit the criteria you were talking about, a blue city with a black mayor, LaToya. And then as soon as Governor Landry said like he'd be fine with that, like go ahead and do it, Trump seemed to like back off. So my question is kind of like, why does it seem like he is searching for these fights to go against? And what seems to be the end goal, and how far do you think he's going to go?
It seems like he's searching for the fights because why? He is searching for the fights. That's literally what he's doing. And the question of why has to do with the topic of my seminar next Tuesday, which is going to be populist authoritarianism. The question of why is that in addition to scoring political points, there's a consolidation of presidential power that's happening that is really only being able to be manifest if he is successful in saying, I declare that there's crime over here, I declare that this entity is going to do this, and look at that, regardless of what the stats say, regardless of what the conditions are, we've actually solved the problem. This is the nature of populist authoritarianism, that there's only one man, and I use man, you know, specifically, who is capable of solving the problems that the populace has. And so I think, you know, to Eduardo's, to your response to Eduardo's point, is that people fall into that idea that that crime is being solved through this muscular deployment of the military, and it's not true. If we declared that there's going to be a curfew and nobody can ever go outside for the next 3 weeks, I could do that. Crime would drop. Is that a good policy solution to this? No, but that's what his goal is. His goal is to actually test these situations so that he can call them out. And I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but watch what happens in the midterms when he says those, if the results are false, and watch what happens in prior to the next election when he says you can't actually trust the people that are counting the votes. The muscularity around the National Guard will come into play again in ways that we might not really want to see happen.
So unfortunately, we run out of time for questions. I thank you all for all the great questions you had. I thank everyone for coming out tonight. Please come again. We have an event next week talking about the shifting politics on Israel. We have an event with 2 conservatives arguing whether the Populist Project is working, and a lot more. So watch our newsletter. You should all be getting it. Thank you so much. And thank you very, very much for our panelists, all of whom got on an airplane to come here. And we'll see you at the next event.